Let's talk Astartes, power armor and bolt guns with an overview of Space Marines in 9th edition 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the forces of the Adeptus Astartes and doing a bit of an overview of the army in 9th edition as it stands. We'll go through their current strengths and weaknesses, core rules, a bunch of their stronger selections from the codex, all of the units in brief, and finish up with a few ideas for stronger army lists. I will start off by saying that Space Marines are really a very varied faction within 40k. They have an absolutely enormous roster of units, so two lists could look very different if you wanted them to, and different chapters have very different playstyles that encourage you to use different parts of their roster. In this video, I'm largely going to be focusing on the core codex, the actual codex Space Marines, more than all these supplements, and perhaps some of the strong stuff that could be generalised to multiple different Space Marine armies. I have done at least brief overviews of all the other chapters in 9th edition at one point or another, so feel free to search them up if you'd like to see some more details on one chapter. Currently, I'd rank Space Marines in general as around about a mid-tier faction in Warhammer 40k. Towards the start of 9th edition, I'd say they were pretty solidly in the top tier, powerful datasheets like Eradicators, Blade Guard, and a few others really ruling the roost. But as all of the other codexes came out for 9th edition, they've been gradually codex crept, to the extent, while even being a very popular faction with a whole ton of players at events, they aren't being met with all that much success. Armour of Contempt is the latest biggest news for them, and it has given them a really massive durability boost across the entire faction, but even with this it certainly hasn't propelled them to Space Marines stomping tournaments or anything, though I'd argue it probably has put them at a bit of an advantage as opposed to their other close rival armies. Certainly armies like Necrons, Admech and Orcs don't get on too well with Space Marines with tougher saves and ignoring AP-1 effectively. Within Space Marines there are essentially 11 different sub-chapters. These do all vary in strength a fair bit. A few of them, like particularly Raven Guard and Imperial Fists, tend to be more of a challenge to win with, whereas others, maybe Black Templars and Dark Angels in particular, seem to be having quite a lot more success. Perhaps more so than a lot of other armies, a lot of their real strength comes from their sub-faction rules, seeing as they get entire codexes full of loads of stratagems, warlord traits and relics to draw on, and these are often better than the main book. For current strengths in 40k, perhaps their biggest one is the sheer amount of unit diversity and playstyle changes that you can make. They're incredibly adaptable to be able to tailor themselves to the current meta and threats that you might be expecting, and they tend to have a fair amount of power from the fairly decent buffing characters that also fight well in melee. Things like captains, chaplains and librarians all can give you some serious boosts to your nearby units, and then also lend a hand to cut up the foe when they get close. They're quite forgiving and generalist as armies go. Even basic marines can usually pack at least a fair punch in combat and can hold up okay to small arms, so they're not going to be punished as hard for being out of position or exposed compared with, say, Eldar, and that's become even more true with Armour of Contempt. They've got very tough against AP-1 and AP-2 weapons in particular. Transhuman Physiology in particular is quite nice for Primaris units as well, a pop-up durability boost when you need it, and they do remain having a fair few strong datasheets, things like Redemptor Dreadnoughts, Vanguard Veterans and Eradicators. They're all pretty efficient for the points cost, I think. In terms of weaknesses, having such a large roster does mean that a fair few things get overshadowed or made redundant. In particular, non-core vehicles really struggle at the moment and are largely quite underwhelming against the core firepower options. Marines are generally fairly elite no matter which way you field them, so a few key casualties can really punish the army, and they're quite susceptible to high strength, damage 2 and 3 weapons with decent AP. If you come up against an army that's spamming a whole load of those, then they're going to go down quite quickly. While it's quite nice that they do have some combat ability each, it does mean that they're sort of jack of all trades, paying for abilities in multiple phases, so aren't likely to be quite as efficient as a unit dedicated just to doing one thing. And I would say that currently across the board the raw damage and durability just isn't super amazing compared with a lot of the more recent codex releases. Generally marine lists do have to lean quite heavily into their synergy with characters if they want to reach their pinnacles of damage or defense. So first up, let's start through the Space Marines core rules, which perhaps out of any of the armies of 40k have had a whole load of band-aid patches applied. As you can probably tell here by the fact that standard Space Marines have around about 7 special rules on the go all at the same time. Rather than decreasing points cost or inflating stats further, Games Workshop instead apply a bunch of special rules to make them feel chunky and mighty on the battlefields of 40k. First up, and this will know no fear, means that they ignore combat attrition modifiers. It doesn't really prevent them from a single Marine running here and there anymore, but it usually would mean that you'd be quite unlucky to have squads running away en masse. Occasionally it's kind of relevant. Some armies do have native debuffs to combat attrition, like the new Chaos Knights, so it'd certainly help from morale casualties from them. In general though, it's often not hugely powerful, as Marines often like to operate in small squads. Then we've got Shock Assault, an extra attack in the first round of combat. Means that even basic Marines will have a fair few strength 4 attacks going around to bully light infantry, but does mean that their combat effectiveness falls off a bit if they're stuck down in combat for multiple turns. Bolter Discipline is their ability to rapid fire their bolters out to 24 inches if they remain still, or if they're a bike or Terminator. Certainly doesn't hurt a few random tactical Marines, intercessors with bolt rifles, or incursors or infiltrators crack off a few extra shots. Maybe it's a bit more relevant on things like Terminator Stormbolters to blaze away as you drop in and stomp forwards. Combat squads mean that big Space Marine squads of 6 or 10 can split into 2 separate halves. It can give you a bit of flexibility in game whether or not you want to keep a big squad together. Say for example, a massive melee unit of Vanguard veterans could divide into 2 halves if they think they need to play a bit more of a trading units game, or stay together if they just want to deliver an enormous melee punch to a tough enemy like a big unit of Terminators. It can also be handy for filling out force organisation slots and getting lots of small units while not using too many detachment slots. Could be handy for things like Eradicators, which typically work quite well in small units. Next up we have Combat Doctrines, the Space Marine Pure Army benefit, extra AP for the heavy weapons turn 1, then 1 or 2 turns of Tactical Doctrine for assault and rapid fire weapons getting extra AP, then the Assault Doctrine for melee and pistols getting more dangerous. It depends on how much armour the foe's bringing. If they've got a lot of very high save units, then they really can be quite meaningful, particularly on low AP weapons like bolters, or random Marines getting into melee without combat weapons to make them all AP -1. But against other foes, say for example Chaos Demons with high invuls, it won't make too much difference. Often just as important is your given chapter's super doctrine. Say for example the Blood Angels Assault one makes it far more valuable, and you can spend a couple of command points to put a unit in a different doctrine, which can be really meaningful if you're both getting the extra AP boost and also whatever else the super doctrine gives you. Next we have the new Armour of Contempt, essentially an army-wide rule that gives you +1 save against anything that's AP -1 or better, though it doesn't affect a few units such as ones that carry storm shields. This one has been a very meaningful boost to make Marines stick around a bit longer, a particularly big toughness boost to things with 2+ saves like Terminators for example. Even a standard issue Terminator with no shield or anything in cover now will still be saving things like AP -4 weapons on a 4+, which is seriously quite impressive. As changes go, I think it's made things like low-level invul saves, like 5+ invuls, into being a bit more meaningless, and certainly storm shields are nowhere near as good value as they used to be, though I think a few of them can still be pretty handy for units like Vanguard veterans, saving on 3+ against AP0 normally. Finally, we've got each army's chapter tactics, which will vary greatly depending on the codex. We'll talk through them briefly later, but it does mean that running a standard Space Marine in Warhammer 40K does have a pretty hefty ton of external advantages going for him, as well as just the standard stat line. Moving on, I thought we'd talk through some of the stronger rules sections from the core codex, warlord traits, relics, and the rest, though I would bear in mind that a lot of the alternatives from the supplement books are often stronger than these, so for your given chapter, the core codex options are only going to be half the story. For the main 2 warlord trait tables from the codex, there's Rights of War and Imperium's Sword, which I think are some of my favourites. Rights of War I think is perhaps the most commonly taken warlord trait. It gives you an aura of objective secured, meaning that you can take objectives quite easily with just the character themselves or your more elite units. And for just a 1 command point buy-in, it's really quite a powerful ability that often will translate into more victory points in game. Otherwise, if you're just looking for flat extra melee, an extra attack and strength from Imperium's Sword is rarely a bad idea, plus it lets you re-roll charges, and if you need a bit of extra defense, then you can get a 6+ feel no pain and +1 wound from a different one. Maybe my favourite out of the Phobos ones is Lord of Deceit, that allows you to redeploy 3 Phobos units. Really quite powerful in combination with 4 deployment things. It means that you could set them up aggressively and then whisk them back if the opponent looks like they're just going to wipe them first turn. As well as these, I think a lot of the other stronger traits are from the chapter command section, things like Wise Orator or Selfless Healer, which we'll go over in that section. Relics wise, I must admit I do find the core Codex Space Marines ones a bit on the disappointing side. In general, I feel like quite a lot of the supplement books have some more exciting stuff. If I had to pick a few favourites though, then the Benediction of Fury for the damage 3 Crozius with mortal wounds is pretty nice on a Smash Chaplain. Grab that, take Mantra of Strength, and maybe even the Imperium's Sword, and you've got a guy hitting with horrendous damage each turn. The Teeth of Terror seems like a great option just for a default cheap smash character. The basic chainsaw doesn't cost you any points, and getting 3 extra attacks at strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2 is really quite sweet. You'll certainly go through elite infantry like there's no tomorrow. For Primaris Marines, the Voxa Spiritum can be pretty handy. An extra 3 inches to your aura abilities is particularly good with apothecaries to make their feel no pain go further. Doesn't hurt at all on captains or lieutenants or things either. And if you need a defensive relic, then the Armor Indomitors can be a popular pick. It gives you a 2+ armor save, +1 wound, and a 3+ invul for a turn. It's quite nice on things like librarians or lieutenants, who without an iron halo or an invul save of any sort can often die quite easily. If one of these is critical, then that relic could easily be a decent way to stop them getting taken out, at least for one crucial turn with that 3+ invul. Otherwise, there's quite a lot of relics that are generally present in every single supplement book, things like the 5+ feel no pain from the adamantine mantle, or +1 damage from the mastercrafted weapon. Both of those could be handy if you just want a bit more damage or defense. Moving on, for psychic powers, there's the Librarius and the Obscuration discipline within the core book. Out of these two, I feel like the Librarius is generally more powerful, as the Obscuration one tends to be a bit focused around Phobos, which, while being very strong units for screening and utility purposes, aren't really ones that you want to plough loads of extra buffs into for the most part. Perhaps some of my favourite ones from Librarius are Psychic Fortress for the 5+ invul bubble. That's really quite nice on Dreadnought castles, though again arguably might be a little bit less relevant now Armour of Contempt is a thing, as it's only really going to be relevant against AP -4 or better. Otherwise, Might of Heroes can give one core or character model +1 strength, toughness and attack, can be quite nice on Redemptor Dreadnoughts or on a Smash character, and Null Zone can be a nice tricky counter one to remove invuls within 6 inches, hopefully allowing a dangerous marine squad to plough straight through a unit of enemy elites. Out of Obscuration, I quite like the -1 to hit one, and Tenebrous Curse to mess with enemy movement, but to be honest, even out of both disciplines, I think in general you're usually going to be better off with the ones from the actual codexes. Certain psychic trees, like say the Space Wolf one, or White Scars or Deathwatch, they're all very tempting indeed. Otherwise, for the Angry Faithful Chaplains, the Litanies of Battle I think all have their uses, and a Master of Sanctity with Wise Orators a pretty reasonable choice. If you want a fighty character, then Mantra of Strength meaningfully puts him into rage mode, +1 strength attack and damage is a very sweet combo. Canticle of Hate gives you an extra 2-inch charges plus extra consolidation. That's a really nice tool for delivering deep striking units into the fray, makes their charge into a 7-inch one which is very reliable, and doesn't really hurt for units trying to zoom their way across the board into combat either. Then you've got 2 melee buffs in the standard reroll hits one or +1 to wound, 2 decent range buffs for +1 to hit or +1 to wound the closest target, and even the Litany of Faith, the one that I initially was pretty down on when it first came out, that's the 5+ save against mortal wounds. Now there's really quite a prevalence of armies doing a lot of their damage via mortal wounds, even that's a pretty reasonable choice to buy in for some defense. If you've got some big meaningful units to put these on, I think it's hard to go too far wrong with your best pick out of any of the 7. For secondary objectives, out of the 3 I much prefer Oaths of Moment. It is a small leg up that Marines have on plenty of the other armies in the secondaries game. It's just an objective that's fairly easy to achieve, killing vehicles, monsters or characters, holding the centre of the board with a tough unit, and not falling back or failing morale. You're quite likely to do a whole ton of that throughout the game as it goes on anyway. Provided you can hold the centre for at least a turn or two, you're quite likely to score pretty high. Moving on, we have Chapter Command, the points cost upgrade for characters. Out of the 7 choices, I think most of them are pretty meaningful. The only one I'm not really the biggest fan of is the Ancient one, though I guess that's more because Ancients in general I think are a bit on the weak side right now. For the Chaplains, the Master of Sanctity is pretty much an auto-include, doubling his litany casting and also accessing the Wise Orator Warlord trait, again near enough an auto buy-in for 1 command point to make both of those litanies go off on a more reliable 2+. If you're using a Chaplain, I would use this. The Tech Marine can take Master of the Forge, a pretty reasonable boost for the cost for his healing potential. Regenerating 3 wounds on a single vehicle is very nice. The Chief Librarian does seem to see a fair amount of play. It gets you an extra denial and an extra psychic power option, so your cycle will be a bit more flexible, plus it also can allow you to take that +1 to cast Warlord trait with Psychic Mastery. I don't think it's really mandatory on a Librarian, but if you want a more reliable caster with more flexibility, then it seems absolutely fine as a buy-in. Next is the Chief Apothecary with Selfless Healer. If you're taking an apothecary, then this one allows you to resurrect a model each turn for free. I think the majority of people tend to buy this in if you're running an apothecary in the first place, though if you do have a fair few command points and you don't really need them too desperately, then you can just pay the command point tax to use that very nice resurrection stratagem. If you're running a company champion, I'd pretty much upgrade them to the chapter champion by default. It gives him access to a few better combat stats, and perhaps more importantly, allows him to take the Blade of Triumph relic power sword, which gives him strength 7 and damage 3, which for his fairly small points cost plus a relic I think is a fairly fighty character. You just need to weigh up whether or not you want to actually have some extra buffs which you would get from a captain. Speaking of which, you can upgrade a captain to a chapter master. This one's the most expensive upgrade of the lot at 40 points, but allows you to nominate one squad to get 4 rerolls to hit. I think it's quite an expensive upgrade, but at the same time can be worth it if you've got some meaningful things to buff. Ideally maybe giving those rerolls to a shooty dreadnought turn 1, then bounding him forward and giving it to a melee squad turn 2, or maybe even to himself if he needs the extra damage. It also allows access to the Master of the Codex Warlord traits to allow a little bit of farming command points, and the Angel's Artifice, which can make him a bit tougher if you need him to be. I'd say it's around about worth the 40 points. It's a bit of a take or leave depending on what other units you're running for me. Next up we have the Marine Stratagems. They do have a fair amount available, and of course many more in their various supplements. I feel that maybe a few of the most important or valuable ones are these 4 at the top. Transhuman Physiology is a big advantage of the Primaris Marines, 1 CP to only be wounded on a 4+ if you've got 5 or less models in the squad. Particularly good on Toughness 4 Space Marines when they were going to be wounded on 2s, it can save you an awful lot of damage for very cheap. Auspex Scan can make enemy units have to drop a bit further away unless they want to be fried by your ranged squads. Adaptive Strategy is the 2 CP one to put a squad in a different combat doctrine, can be very meaningful for the AP alone, but even more so if you're going to be getting another advantage, like say the Salamanders +1 to wound with melter weapons. And for 1 command point, I think that Wisdom of the Ancients can often be a really good boost from a Dreadnought, re-rolling 1s to hit for core units nearby. That's potentially accessing a lot of extra damage for nearby shooting units, and it's pretty nice if you have a few decent things in range. There's a lot of other situational or unit specific stuff. I'll try and mention at least a few things as we go through the units, but perhaps here are a few of the nicer damage or defensive buffs. The Intercessors can get some pop-up damage with Assault Intercessors fighting twice, or regular Intercessors shooting twice. If it makes the difference between killing the last of an enemy squad, then that's all well and good. Terminators can access the +1 to hit, very nice for using -1 to hit things like Power Fists or Thunderhammers, and Gene-Wrought Might can just dial up the heat for Primaris in melee in general. Besides Transhuman, Armour of Contempt can give you a Feel No Pain type save against mortal wounds on vehicles, not bad to remember if you've got some Dreadnoughts in play, and Gravis Armour can shrug off damage 1 weapons extra well with a +1 to your save, very nasty against things with Armour of Contempt. Finally, for the layers of special rules, I thought we'd briefly go through each of the Space Marine chapters, though as I mentioned before, I have touched on these at least briefly in their own videos, and each of them have their own gimmicks that's far too much to explain in just one short Space Marine video. Which chapters tend to be the strongest maybe is a bit nebulous. Their fortunes tend to wax and wane a bit as different people experiment with them, but in the broadly stronger category I'd probably put Iron Hands, Dark Angels and Black Templars, who are maybe just a little bit ahead of the rest of the field. Iron Hands basically do shooting very well between their Grav Devastators, decent heavy support doctrine, and a fair few useful stratagems like pop-up Feel No Pains. Plus they have absolutely great synergy with vehicles, particularly with their psychic powers and warlord traits, and a few other very nasty tricks as well, such as Student of History to phase a captain in and out of melee without being hit, and making a heavy firepower Contempt Dreadnought into a character so you can't shoot it directly due to Lookout Sir. They function pretty nicely as successors as well, maybe tooling them more up for melee, and then just using all their other synergies to make their shooting good. Dark Angels have been one of the all-round strong chapters since their codex released. Transhuman and Obsec Deathwing Terminators are probably the single strongest thing in the book, and just about every unique section of the book is pretty strong. Their psychic powers cancelling Obsec and making people fight last are great. They've got some very solid warlord traits, decent rerolls, Ravenwing Apothecaries for healing, and you can also play them in very different styles as well, Ravenwing zipping around the board with Obsec, or Gunline Elements being very nice with +1 to hit. Black Templars do the playstyle of Marines stomping towards objectives in the midfield, boosted by decent characters well. Helbrecht and Grimoldus are both very nice buffing pieces, and Helbrecht can lend a hand in melee very nicely as well. You can really support some big chunky Crusader squads, Terminator squads, or Van Vets with these. Throw in a few Relic Bearers into the squads to make them tougher, and maybe resurrect those tough models with an Apothecary when they're slain. They've also got good relics, their own unique roster of litanies, including a 5+ feel no pain one, and a very tough Bike Chaplain build with Tannhauser's Bones. Moving into maybe some of the more mid-tier armies, we've got White Scars, Space Wolves, Deathwatch, Ultramarines, Salamanders, and Blood Angels. Maybe out of these throughout 9th edition, Salamanders and Blood Angels have been struggling a bit more than the other four. White Scars have the great advance and charge and shooting with assault weapons, Corsaro can't amp up their melee, extra damage in their melee doctrine, and some Mighty Smash Chaplains on bikes. Space Wolves have huge melee power. They potentially run as successor chapters with Whirlwind of Rage, which could allow them to have double exploding 6s to hit. Combine that with a Chaplain or Chapter Master, and you've got a seriously lethal melee force on your hands. They've got some pretty good psychic powers as well, and the Armour of Rust to encourage some fighting last for your opponent. Deathwatch have their troops Auspex kill teams, which you can run in their new Army of Renown formation, which allows you to clone other chapters' chapter tactics. They've got a bunch of teleport shenanigans, and a decent psychic power for a 5+ feel no pain, and if you want they can also build some very strong Dreadnought Castle builds as well, as they've just got a lot of buffing relics and support for that. For Ultramarines they get on very well with heavy and rapid fire weapons due to their combat doctrine allowing them to move and shoot, and they'll really like anything that forward deploys due to their rapid redeployment stratagem, potentially allowing them to set up Invictus in the midfield, then pull them back if you don't go first. They've got a lot of decent options for buffing support characters, and a very nice Seal of Oath relic for some rerolls, and are just generally quite a tactically flexible army with their stratagems too. Salamanders go mad for their Flamers and Melters with their +1 to wound. They have a nice reroll each time they attack as well, which makes their units a bit more dangerous. A lot of their stratagems add raw power or raw defense, which is very nice, and they have a nasty countercharge one. And they also have a fun captain build where you can make, say, a chapter master on bike obscenely tough with toughness 7 and -1 to wounds. Blood Angels have perhaps been seeing a bit more success post Armour of Contempt, as a lot of their units didn't have decent invul saves like Sanguinary Guard or Death Company. Now they're a little bit tougher, maybe their fast moving, powerful melee is going to shine through a bit more. In general, for the most part, they want to be hurtling at you born on jump packs, supported by some very nice support characters like Sanguinary Priests and Ancients, and maybe Dante or a Chapter Master. Finally, throughout the entirety of 9th edition, the Raven Guard and Imperial Fists do seem to have been struggling the most, perhaps, and people generally tend to prefer to try and win with other chapters, it seems. They both do have their own good things going for them. Raven Guard have lots of redeployment shenanigans and have decent ways to make first turn charges. Their stealthy tactics, also making them tougher at range, can be quite nice with Armour of Contempt as well. Though I'd say that Imperial Fists are perhaps one of the most neglected chapters out of any of them. They basically have a very solid chapter tactic with better bolters and ignore cover, a decent support relic in the Eye of Hypnoth, and not really a lot else that's particularly outstanding. Finally, I would bear in mind that a lot of these can trade out their core chapter tactics for successor chapters. The most common combo tends to be Born Heroes and Whirlwind of Rage, +1 to hit and exploding 6s to hit in the first round of melee and on the charge. It just means that you can have spectacularly dangerous melee in just about whatever chapter you want to play, provided you're willing to pass up the chapter tactic and not take any of the special characters. It seems to be a particularly popular choice for Iron Hands, Space Wolves, and Raven Guard to take use of that. Though there are a fair few other useful successor traits. Stealthy is a bit more relevant with Armour of Contempt. Master Artisans gives you a small damage boost on each and every unit, and the one that's +1 to advance and charge can be nice too for delivering your units into melee. Moving on, let's briefly run through the vast roster of Space Marine units. I talked over these in a big Space Marine unit overview recently on the channel, which I'll link down in the video description below if you're interested. Starting out, let's go for the infantry and bikes. In general, Space Marine lists usually want at least some troops, but not to go overboard on them as they aren't the best damage dealers. Typically, I'd want to take a unit or two of infiltrators or incursors to make sure that you're contesting the midfield. Both of them are good depending on whether you want cheap and more melee or to deny deep strike. And then for a bit of OBSEC starting in your own deployment zone, a unit or two of intercessors or assault intercessors, the latter maybe if you're playing a dedicated melee chapter. I think heavy intercessors and tactical marines are a bit more niche in application, not really too far behind the other troops, but are both pretty rarely used competitively. The elite section for the marine infantry is one of the most exciting. Terminators became very interesting with Armour of Contempt and their 2+ saves. The relic Terminators I think are quite nice for most chapters, and of course in particular for Dark Angel's Deathwing where they get the transhuman thing. Vanguard veterans tend to be the workhorse fast melee unit, often packing jump packs, lightning claws, and maybe storm shields. Being pretty fast, hard hitting, and fairly tough for the cost is a great combo, and they're one of the better units to layer buffs on. Blade Guard veterans are a little bit tougher but don't have as much speed. Access to transhuman physiology isn't bad at all though, and damage 2 is great against other marines, and you can field some small cheap units, cheap servitors for screening or holding down backfield objectives for very minimal cost, or company veterans to provide a bit of lookout sir, and again they can be a very cheap unit to do actions and stuff. Maybe a lot of the rest of the slot is a bit overshadowed. Aggressors, Centurion assault squads, veteran intercessors, stern guard scouts and reavers I think often tend to be a bit overlooked as a lot of other units do their roles very similarly or better. For fast attack, my favourite unit are probably the attack bikes. Cheap, fast moving and packing multi-melters, they certainly do a lot of damage for their points and a core as well, and also quite a nice expendable threat that you can throw onto objectives and not worry too much if they're removed in return. You could use Invader ATVs and Land Speeders for a bit more of a durable role for the same thing. I feel that for most lists, a lot of the rest of the units are a little bit on the overcosted side. I guess Dark Angels do a bit better with a lot of the bikers, and Ultramarines can be okay with suppressors, allowing them to move and shoot without taking the penalty to hit. Inceptors with plasma can be very dangerous as well, but you do sort of need to build around supporting them, and after they have done an alpha strike, they do tend to be a bit fragile. Finally, for heavy support, I think a lot of the units are very usable again. Eliminators are pretty great. Very cheap and very tough little units with cover and armour of contempt, and their sniping isn't bad by 9th edition standards, and is particularly useful now the bodyguard rule has been nerfed a fair bit. I quite like the way that you can flex them between screening, starting on midfield objectives, and just sitting back and sniping depending on the opponent as well. Devastators can be pretty solid and are often used rolled into a drop pod with grav cannons or multi-melters. You can fit 2 squads in a drop pod and they can give you a massive alpha strike if you want to. Eradicators are one of the most solid sources of anti-tank firepower in the whole book. Pretty massive damage with either regular or heavy melter rifles, and you could potentially outflank them with strategic reserve to hit very hard from their 24-inch range. Perhaps the Hellblasters and Devastator Centurions are a bit more overshadowed. The Centurions I just don't think are very well costed for their points, but I suppose the Hellblasters can be kind of interesting for volume fire with quite a decent amount of AP. Moving on, we have the vehicles. Starting with the Dreadnoughts and Walkers, I feel that the Redemptor Dreadnought is perhaps the best all-round heavy firepower with core in the book. Macroplasmas, Onslaught Gatling cannons, and the other small arms do a fair bit of work, plus they actually pack some pretty hefty melee punch against heavies if the opponent gets close. If you want raw firepower, then maybe Relic Contemptors are one of the best, with twin Volkite Culverins, las cannons, and maybe backed up by Cyclone missiles. A bit more fragile for the cost perhaps, but still get the job done. Otherwise, Venerable Dreads set up with las cannons and missile launchers can be a good long-range threat, and the Invicta Tactical Warsuit, as I mentioned, is particularly nice with Ultramarines, where you can both have your cake and eat it with setting up forward and pull them back with the stratagem if the opponent gets first turn. I guess Ironclads can be an okay distraction Carnifex, but I think they do struggle a bit with their slow movement. Leviathan Dreadnoughts can be a fairly decent powerhouse, particularly if you support them with a Tech Marine maybe, and in general I'd rather run Venerable Dreadnoughts over the regular one. Their numbers just work out a little bit better and are less susceptible to modifiers. For the heavy support vehicles, I think they're largely lackluster. Generally the fire support just doesn't fare well against the core units that you can make better with captain or lieutenant buffs. Maybe a few of my favourites out of the heavy support section are the Gladiators, who I think do have okay damage and defense given multiple points drops. The Vindicator can be pretty interesting as a distraction Carnifex. The damage output's pretty random, but it is toughness 8 and a 2+ save against range for a fairly cheap cost. It's quite tough with armour of contempt. And the Whirlwind's a pretty interesting choice, mainly more because it hands out fights last to an important enemy unit each turn, although I guess it could chip away at a very small amount of ignores line of sight damage for the cost. The Thunderfire I think is pretty bad, but it can use the stratagem to slow movement, which I guess could be worth it. And most of the rest of the heavy support I'm just not the biggest fan of. Firestrike servo turrets are fairly weak. Land Raiders are fairly tough, but their rules just don't really work that well. And Predators, Repulsors, Stalkers and Hunters just don't really add enough firepower for their cost. In the fast attack section, out of the Land Speeders and Storm Speeders, I think that the better options are maybe cheap Land Speeders with multi-melters for some expendable scoring threats plus a bit of chipping in firepower. I feel they're a bit fragile to be loading up with anything heavier than that though, and the storm speeders do feel like real glass cannons. They hit fairly hard with very decent movement, but they get killed very easily in return as well. Transport wise, drop pods can be worth it for maybe Devastators or Stern Guard veterans with a bunch of melter maybe. I think both Rhinos and Razorbacks are fine, but are just maybe lacking for good options to transport in them. A lot of marine stuff likes to foot slog or just not be in transports in the first place. The Landspeeder Storm for the scouts I think might actually be one of the most competitive transports, weirdly just because you can slingshot it onto objectives and use it as a relatively tough and very fast moving expendable unit that you don't really worry about losing and trades out well. And for the Primaris Marines, I think the Impulsor is kind of at borderline usability. It is a big power move to slingshot OBSEC troops onto objectives, and can be a nice battlefield bunker for Blade Guard to jump out of, but currently I feel it's just costed a bit too high for any real mass shooters. Finally, and a bit dismally, I think all the flyers are really quite weak for the damage and defense. You really pay a massive premium for their mobility, and the Hammerfall bunker is probably one of the weakest Space Marine units out of any of them. It's got deployment and setup issues, has very weak damage output that only hits on a 4+, and might only scrape away to being worth it in really big apocalypse games where it's got absolutely tons of targets. Finally, looking through the Space Marine characters, I think the vast majority of the cast of support characters is actually very usable, and they've done well to have all of them have their role and not really oppress the other choices too much. Captains generally tend to be the most common pick, a solid all-rounder that's very tough and decent in melee, or giving some simple uncomplicated buffs, a very nice place for bearing relics and warlord traits, and lieutenants can be a decent cut price option. They're a bit more efficient for the amount of buffing that they do, but they don't get the Iron Halo or as good stats in melee. We've already mentioned chaplains a couple of times, particularly biker and jump chaplains are very nice to get their litanies exactly where they need to be. Depending on the army, they can really soup up a ranged unit, or massively support a melee one, or deliver jump troops into battle. Librarians, I think, are usually going to want to use the chapter-specific discipline. Their use heavily depends on the chapter. For Space Wolves, they can provide some great support in melee, like Fights Last, or getting them into Assault Doctrine. For Death Watch, you've got the 5+ Feel No Pain power, and a boost to their hitting power in combat as well. If you've got a lot of vehicles, then I think a Tech Marine's typically reasonable. The Primaris one in particular has very decent stats, is fairly tough, hits quite hard, and has that nice Forge Bolter. And healing and +1 to hit is very nice on non-core vehicles, being some of the only boosts that they can get. Then moving into the elite section, we have the Judiciars. You basically just bind them in for Fights Last. They tend to have most value on chapters that can get bigger heroic intervention ranges. Space Wars can do that with a stratagem. The Apothecaries are okay in big armies with high wound, high value models. When you're resurrecting units like Terminators or Blade Guard each turn, you're going to get your value back quite quickly. They can be quite a nice place to bear relics and warlord traits as well for a more buffing sort of role. The company champion is cheap and fighty. If all you want is a counter-attack character with a big heroic intervention range, then this will do that well. Quite nice as a lurking threat that could take that damage 3 power sword and hack apart some high value infantry. And finally, Ancients I'd say are probably the only character that I don't think really works all that well at the moment. They give you the chance for some extra shooting on death. They're kind of an okay upgrade to a big infantry gunline castle if that's what you're running. Otherwise I probably wouldn't bother unless you've got a very fancy chapter specific banner on the go. For example, the Dark Angels one, which can allow their Deathwing to be harder to kill. Finally, I thought we'd just whiz through a few examples of some competitive Space Marine lists, past and present. I did talk about a couple of these in the recent Every List in 40k video, so I'll just skim over them fairly quickly now. One recent one post Armour of Contempt is the Iron Hands one that took 5th at the Frontier Open Grand Tournament by Colin K. This one's bringing together really quite a lot of the strong Iron Hands things and using it on a couple of big non-core units in the mighty Forge World Astartes and the Leviathan Dreadnought. It's an Iron Hands successor in a battalion and a super heavy auxiliary, taking Born Heroes and Whirlwind of Rage for the extra melee. The Astartes is an enormous tank with some massive firepower, and you can soup it up with the Librarian's Steel armor and Reforge, and the Tech Marine can give the Astartes +1 to hit and -1 damage with the Ironstone. The Leviathan Dreadnought is extra hard to kill as well. It's upgraded to a Warlord trait with a 5+ Feel No Pain from All Flesh's weakness, and it's good in combat with its Siege Drill, and deals a fair bit of damage with Volkite Calivers and a Grav Bombard too. Otherwise, there's a decent amount of squads for objectives, 2 units of 5 Incursors, 1 unit of Assault Intercessors, all of which will hit a bit harder than you'd expect in melee due to the chapter tactic. A great big unit of eradicators with the heavy melter rifles, which Iron Hands will use well, moving and shooting with full accuracy and re-rolling ones to hit turn 1. They should have themselves a pretty solid chance of killing any one hard target, and a couple of company veterans for some support and lookout sir for the characters. For a bit of cheap fightiness, there's a company champion with chapter champion and that blade of triumph, and then a massively stacked fighty chapter master with jump pack, lightning claw, and thunderhammer. He re-rolls hits with merciless logic, has student of history, an iron hands trait to allow him to bounce in and out of combat without the enemy striking back, and also has mastercrafted weapon to make that thunderhammer damage 4. Finally, there's an allied inquisitor for a bit of command point farming, and could be used for some psychic secondary objectives if needed. Very solid, and if anyone's going to make non-core vehicles work well, then it's probably the Iron Hands. Otherwise, we'll just skim over a few more lists in a little bit less detail. This one's a Raven Guard one by Marius Ryback, who used it to take second at the Hobart GT early in 9th. This one's a successor chapter with +1 to charge and exploding 6s to hit. Raven Guard have their stratagem to put units in Deep Strike Reserve for 1 command point, so this one has 3 big units of Assault Centurions dropping down and hoping to make some 8-inch charges, no doubt boosted by some command point rerolls before dealing some massive damage. Otherwise, there's a Smash Chaplain on bike with Mantra of Strength and Benediction of Fury, which will hit very hard and Ds, and a Primaris Librarian with Master of Ambush, one that allows you to deploy a threatening unit very far forward, such as maybe those aggressors with Flamestorm Gauntlets. Otherwise, there's some solid troops for objective scoring, and a couple of zippy attack bikes and a Vanguard Vet squad. Next up, we've got a White Scars battalion, this one again from early 9th edition, and a list that was run by Oliver Smith to win W4 Gaming GT. White Scars get on very well with the big units of Vanguard veterans with Storm Shields and Lightning Claws, their unique doctrine making Lightning Claws all damage 2, and if Corsair Khan can keep up with them, then he can give them an extra +1 to wound as well, meaning that they'll absolutely shred. As well as that, there's a unit of Incursors and some Intercessors with auto bolt rifles, which are nice for advancing and charging with White Scars and shooting 2. And then there's a Dreadnought Castle with a couple of Relic Contemptors with Volkites and Typhoon missiles, backed up by a Tech Marine for some repairs and +1 to hit, and a couple of Landspeeder Storms and an attack bike for grabbing some objectives. Finally, here's an Ultramarines example from a few months back, this one run by Daniel Smith to take 3rd at Melee at Schiller, and it's a fairly walker heavy one, 3 Redemptor Dreadnoughts with Macroplasma as a firebase, shielded by Tigurius' Psychic Fortress for a 5+ invul, and potentially buffed both by a Captured on Bike who's been upgraded to a Chapter Master, and also a Master of Sanctity Chaplain who's got both of the shooting buffs, +1 to hit and +1 to wounds. As they're Ultramarines, they also have a whole load of things starting in the midfield to redeploy with rapid redeployment, 2 Invictors, a Incursors and an Infiltrators unit, some Eradicators with heavy melter rifles who like moving and shooting with the Ultramarines doctrine, and potentially just for holding the battle line pretty well, there's a big unit of Aggressors with Boltstorm Gauntlets, and 1 unit of 5 Intercessors with Bolt Rifles. Both of those could also be pretty nice recipients of the Chaplain buffs if you didn't want to buff the Dreadnoughts. So with those example lists, I think we'll leave that there for today. I hope that at least some of that overview of Space Marines in 9th edition has been fun or useful. It's been kind of fun just to return to look in focus detail at the core codex and talk about some of the most solid options that see a lot of play. If you think there's anything important that I missed, or any fun Space Marine tactics that you've been using recently, please let me know down in the comments below. I look forward to having a read. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, hopefully plenty more for the Space Marines in the future. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to briefly mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Making all the content on the channel, particularly really big long videos like this, does take an enormous amount of effort. If you are enjoying a lot, any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.